Okay, very good morning to dear academicians, professors, research scholars, alumni, and students. Welcome to the third day of the FDP in Behavioural Economics, organized by the Department of Economics, St. Berchmans College, Channasheri, Kerala, India. I hope that the last two lectures extended your knowledge horizon and give you a great learning experience. Today, we have another esteemed resource person, Junofy Anto Rozarina of University of Zurich with us.
Thank you so much for organizing this event. It's always nice to see someone promoting the subject in India, and especially when it's free. So yeah, this is really great. So let me start with a quick introduction. So as you probably know, experiments is one of the most important part of behavioral economic research. And most research currently in behavioral economics is based on experiments, and therefore this is one of the most important methods part of behavioral economics. And this course is basically a 2-semester long course that I teach at the University of Zurich. So it's a quite intense course, and I am basically skipping most of the math part to make it as simple as possible. So you'll basically get the intuition of how an experiment works, and we'll see some examples. So today's course is going to be a little bit technical, whereas tomorrow and the day after tomorrow classes would be a little bit of the application of today's course. So make sure you understand at least the basics today so that you understand the next 2 classes. And yeah, obviously you can ask questions whenever you want, and we'll take 2 small breaks in the middle so that you stay focused throughout. Okay, great. So let's start. And also feel free to answer through the chat here when I ask questions. So how do we assess if policies work? So every time a government or an institution has to introduce a new policy, how do they check if it works? So the traditional way to check it is using secondary data, right? So for example, if you have to find out if providing education to women is beneficial, how would a government check it? So often we use logic here. We try to logically explain why giving education to women could be beneficial. And the other way we approach this is by using data, basically. And let's look at this question. So how should we build a dam across River X? And these questions are often answered by cost-benefit analysis, which I think most of you would have an idea about, but we'll quickly cover it in the next slide as well. So we use logical arguments, we use cost-benefit analysis for analyzing policies. So what are the costs? So let's use the bridge example. So here there are these monetary expenses, the expense the money it takes to build the dam. And there are environmental costs, there are negative externalities, which could include that the fishes could be affected, the nearby locality could be affected, and there are benefits. There are some direct benefits, there are indirect benefits, and there are some positive externalities, which are just positive spillover effects of this project. And if you look at it, there are a lot of negatives, right? So let's take the bridge building example, the dam building example. So if you have to build a dam, you don't know if all of these costs are actually from the dam or from something else that happened at the same time. So it's really possible to remove any other externality. It's possible that people just became more educated, so everything changed. So it's possible that it's not because of the dam itself, right? So it's a little hard to calculate these numbers. So we usually use time series data, the before and after of the project. And the main negative is that as time changes, there's not just one thing changing, there's so many things changing. So you don't know which effect you're capturing in your values, right? So what is a better way to do this? The better way to do it, according to me and according to a lot of researchers, is experiments. So let's start with some simple examples. So I'll be using examples from various fields today, not just from behavioral economics. So we'll try to get a very strong intuition today so that the tomorrow and day after tomorrow session, which is based on behavioral economics, would be much easier. So, so there's this advertisement you would have seen everywhere that Horlicks makes kids taller, stronger, and sharper. Have we ever checked if it's true? Who checks if it's true? So let's just take a question that, let's say we are a researcher and we're trying to find out if Horlicks actually makes kids taller. How do you do that? You can now send it in the chat box here and tell how you would check if Horlicks makes kids stronger or taller. Exactly. So some of you are answering here. So a traditional way would be to just give Horlicks to children and check if they're growing taller. But obviously that has some mistakes, right? So some kids just grow taller than the other kids and so on. What if the kid is just growing and over time kids keep growing? So you don't know if it's because of the Horlicks or if they're just growing, right? So this is where experiment comes in. So let's try to design a very simple experiment for this. So let's take two groups of children and we give Horlicks to one group and we don't give Horlicks to the other group. And basically see if these kids grow taller than these kids. That's a very simple experiment, right? And basically after, let's say, a year, you check if these kids are taller or both are the same height or whatever. So there are few issues that could happen. So basically today's talk would be covering these issues that you need to be careful about when you're doing some intergroup analysis like this. So let's start with how we would do it. So you basically recruit some children, like of whatever age group you're interested in, and you randomly divide them into two groups. You put one in the treatment group. So treatment group is a group which gets the treatment. The treatment here is just eating Horlicks. So there's a group which gets Horlicks, and control group is the group which doesn't get Horlicks. Basically, they don't get anything. And after a particular amount of time, you check if there's a difference, right? And it's very important that this group is not very different. So let's say you're conducting an experiment in India. It's obviously easier to get poor children to join your study because they would be more attracted to the money that you'll be paying. But that's not what we want. We want children who represent the actual population. So you need poor children, you need rich children, you need children from the city, you need a very representative sample. And I'm sure you know how to sample. So we have all these sampling methods, which I will not be covering. But if you don't know, then you can just look at sampling methods to find out how you should sample from the population. Okay, so what would you do if one group accidentally has just taller kids? Let's say you're dividing them into two groups, but it's still possible that one of these groups could accidentally end up having just naturally taller kids. So kids with genes that makes them taller. What do you do when you get that? You can answer now. Right. So even before we start, you should try to make sure that both the groups are similar, because after you start, you really can't see if it's because of Horlicks or if it's because they're just different. So you really, really need to check this before you start. And this is why we use something called randomization. So randomization is basically just randomly allotting people in two different groups without any sort of bias. So a very traditional method would be to just write everybody's name, put it in a lot, and just divide them into two groups. And a little advanced way is to do it online, obviously. And there's so many resources available online, which I'll show a little bit of later as well. And why do we need this control group? Why don't we just have this treatment group? You can keep answering, but I'm going to continue with the talk. So basically, you need to find what the baseline value is. So baseline value is just the naturally occurring value. So what happens if no treatment is given? So let's say your treatment is reading a book. The baseline value is what happens when the person doesn't read the book, basically. And so these are all different terms that we use in experiments, which I think you should definitely learn. So firstly, the treatment. As I said, the treatment here is just giving somebody Horlicks. It has to be very specific. So it can be giving a person like a particular amount of Horlicks in the morning every day with milk or without milk, whatever. It has to be very, very specific. The treatment variable. So treatment variable is just the treatment, but it works somewhere where there are different people, and if you are in this group, you get a value of 1. If you're in this group, you get a value of 0. So it's very similar to a dummy variable that you know, but it's just that every time somebody gets a treatment, they get a 1. When they don't get a treatment, they get a 0, basically. And the outcome variable. So this is the most interesting variable for us. So this is what we're interested in. So what is the outcome here? The outcome here is just the height, because as we said earlier, we're interested to find out if Horlicks makes kids taller. So the outcome variable is the height here. So the outcome variable basically captures what the height of each child is at the end of the experiment. And treatment effect. So treatment effect is the difference between the height of this children and this children. So that is the effect that the treatment, which is drinking Horlicks, has had on us. So let me just quickly explain this again. So treatment is Horlicks. Treatment variable is just a variable that captures this treatment. Outcome variable is whatever you're interested in. So if you're just interested in the height, then the outcome variable is height. But you can be interested in multiple things. You can be interested in finding if Horlicks makes children taller, stronger, and sharper. So you can check all these 3 variables at the same time. And treatment effect is just the difference between this and this. And treatment effect is the most interesting thing in the result of your study, because that's what you're interested in finding, right? And the population of interest is something that you decide. So let's say Horlicks is conducting the study. They can decide which age children they want, which state they should get the kids from. So they could decide to get kids just from Kerala, or they can get it from some other state. And yeah, so that's the population. And from that, you get a sample, because you can't test the whole population. Okay, so the most important thing in an experiment is that an experiment will only work when both the groups are similar. So treatment group and the control group, before the experiment starts, should be very similar. As I said, accidentally, if one group has taller kids than the other group, then your results would be biased. So the way we do it is called covariate balance. So covariate balance is just this activity that we do before the experiment starts, where you try to see if all the parameters that you can already observe are similar. Let me explain what I mean. So let's say there's 40% women in treatment group. You should make sure that there's around that amount of women in the control group as well. If treatment group has majorly rich children, then the control group should also have majorly rich children. If the treatment group has children whose parents are really tall, then the control group should have parents who are similarly tall. So this is covariate balance. So even before you start an experiment, you should make sure both are similar. If you have a large enough sample size, and if your randomization works pretty well, then you automatically get a decent amount of covariate balance, even without you doing any sort of manipulation there. So this is another question. So how many groups can we have in a study? Here we have 2 groups. Can you quickly answer and say how many groups you think we can have? Exactly. So someone just answered n number. So that's actually correct. So you can have any number of groups you want. You can have 30 groups, you can have 40 groups, as long as you have that big sample size. So if you're trying to have a lot of groups, then you should look at something called the power calculation, which is basically a calculation that it's a very, very simple math that helps you find out what sample size you need before you start your experiment to get a decent, significant result, basically. So you can have any number of groups. So for example, you can have 3 groups. One where the kids get Horlicks, one where the kids get Complan, one where the kids get Boost, and the control group. So there's like 4 groups in total. So you can have any number of groups like that. And there are a few other terms that you need to know. So I'll just quickly go through them. So the first one is experimental demand effects. So what are we talking about here? It's just that even before the experiment starts, as an experimenter, the one who's conducting the study, hopefully all of you in the future, would have certain hypotheses in your head. So let's say I work for Horlicks and I'm conducting the study. I would already assume that Horlicks works better than the control group, right? We always have these things in our head. And when the treatment group knows that they are in the Horlicks treatment and the control group knows that they're not in the Horlicks treatment, people, at least not, you cannot fake your height, but in behavioral economics, people tend to act slightly differently. So let's say this is a group where you're giving a treatment where you expect people to be nicer. people, when they know that they're expected to be nicer, tend to act nicer, basically. So when the subject knows what you're trying to study, the point of the experiment gets affected because they start to act like how you want them to act. Another thing to know is the experimenter bias. So let's take the same example. Let's say I work for Horlicks and I'm conducting this study. I want the treatment group to grow taller, right? I want the data to look like it grows taller. And this is actually something that a lot of companies do. They manipulate data this way, and you can never find out that they manipulated the data because they have something called the experimenter bias, where let's say I would look at every child and the parent and send all the tall kids here, send all the short kids here. So in the end, it'll look like these kids are like have grown much taller than these kids, but it's just that they were genetically taller than the other group. So this is experimenter bias. The way we avoid it is basically by randomizing the treatment, as I said. So when you put people in the left or the right group, different groups, you don't pick them, you do it automatically using some sort of randomization. And also, it's really hard to do that, but try not to expect any result before running the experiment. It is like a thing in any research these days to have a hypothesis before you start. It's good to have an idea of what you think the results could be, but when you conduct experiments, especially behavioral economics experiments, try not to have a result in your head already before you start an experiment. So I'll talk about a few of my research tomorrow and day after tomorrow to give you examples of how it looks like. And you'll realize why having a result in your head already could be extremely bad for your result. So if you want a true treatment, then try not to have an idea before you start the experiment and go with an open mind, basically. So let's look at a few other examples, and I expect you to quickly try to come up with experiments that can answer these questions. So is universal basic income beneficial? So universal basic income is the scheme where everybody, irrespective of if they're working or not, gets a particular amount of money every month or every week or whatever. So everybody gets a salary even if they don't work. How would you test this? Right, so you can give this universal basic income to one group of people and not give it to another group of people and see if there's some short-term effects, if there's some long-term effects. So this is an interesting question because a lot of countries are actually testing this right now. So Germany has recently started testing. Switzerland has already tried to test this. So a lot of countries are testing this hypothesis. So the way they do it is basically using these sort of experiments. And just to clarify, because we got some comments on that in the chat, RCT stands for randomized controlled trials. And it's very similar. It's exactly the same as experiments, where you have two different groups and you allot people randomly to these different groups. And yeah, so don't get confused by what RCT is. It's exactly the same as experiments for our understanding. So let's take another question. Does the color red make people hungry? How would you conduct this experiment? So just give it a thought experiment. So just think in your head what you think would be a nice experiment here. So the way a lot of researchers approach this is make people sit in a red room or give them a red paper to answer in. And after the experiment, the fake experiment where they're just made to sit with this condition, they're asked to have some snacks and they basically see how much they eat. So for example, you can have something like, a group sits in a white room, a group sits in a red room, and after it's over, they just give each of them like some snacks, like let's say like 10 biscuits, and they see how many of the 10 biscuits they eat. So let's say a group eats 7 biscuits on an average and another group eats 3 biscuits on an average. You can sort of see that the color has sort of affected people's cognition. And it is said that the color red makes people hungry, and that's why a lot of the logos of many companies like KFC, McDonald's, they all have this red color in them. It makes people hungry. So yeah, this is a proven research. And do people give more charities when they're shown a picture? So these are all questions that I'm trying to make you get more used to experiments. So just try to think of an experiment which would answer this question. So you can give people 2 different treatments. In one treatment, it could be just a request for money for charity, and the other one could be a request for money for charity and showing a picture of the kid that would get help in case the charity is given. And again, this is a proven research that shows that when you show a particular picture of a particular kid or someone who will actually be benefited by the charity, people give much more. Okay, let's take another example and then move on. So does the cognitive ability of children reduce after watching a scary movie? So let's say kids are made to watch a scary movie. Do their cognitive ability decrease after that? So again, this is very simple to conduct. So you take two different treatments. In one treatment, you make the kids watch a scary movie. In the other treatment, you don't make them watch a movie and then ask them to fill some cognitive tests and see if the results are very different in the two groups. Right? Does anyone have any questions here? What is the difference between A/B testing and RCTs? It's the same. It's just a fancy way of saying it. Okay, let's see the other questions later then. So you sort of get the idea of what it looks like, right? So these are all like easier examples because there aren't any issues there. So let's take some more examples which could be a little problematic. And I'll tell you why. So let's say you're attending this FDP. You're attending these talks. How do you know if it's beneficial to you or not? If you compare between your outcomes in the future with someone who did not attend this talk, it's possible that it's because of two different reasons. One is just that they probably didn't know about the talk. The other one is that probably they were less motivated than you, so you're probably much more motivated than them to learn. So comparing you both might not be the best idea, right? So what can you do here? So the way I'll tell you the answer basically, and you can think how it could have a little bit of problems in certain cases. So the way people do it is they get a lot of applicants. So let's say we get like 1,000 applicants for this workshop. And from that, you randomly pick 500 people, give them the opportunity to attend the talk. And for the rest of the 500 people, you don't give them the opportunity to attend the talk. So they were both equally motivated. They both wanted to sign up, but some got lucky and got to attend the talk and some did not. And then you basically compare the results, right? So this is one way to do it. And this is the way that most researchers used to do it. But we'll see why it can be problematic. So for a workshop, it's fine. But for some other major things, it could be problematic. So let's say, should children be taught in their mother tongue? So right now, all the research, like most of the research that studies this, compares children who actually learned in their mother tongue with children who learned in an English medium school in India. So the children who go to an English medium school are very different from the children who go to the local language school. At least, so I'm from Tamil Nadu, and at least in Tamil Nadu, it's like that. And I think it's similar in most other states. So when you learn in your mother tongue, we call this self-selection. So you have selected yourself into that particular group. In this case, your parents have selected yourself into this group. And it's often that educated parents put their children in English medium school. And therefore, when you compare these two groups in the future and make a statement like kids who go to English school learn better or smarter, it's just invalid. It doesn't make any sense. So the actual way to do it would be to randomly put some children in English medium, some children in Malayalam medium or Tamil medium or Hindi medium or whatever, and then compare the results. Now you see why it can be problematic, right? When you have to manipulate this data, you cannot ethically or legally force someone to take education in a particular school, right? And this is exactly why it's hard to conduct research like this, because it's just ethically wrong. So let's take another example. Does studying in an IIT make a student smarter? So it's a perception that a lot of people have, right? Like a student who studied at an IIT is just smarter. Is that true? Is it because of the IIT, or is it just because only smart children can get into IIT? So to get into IIT, there's a huge hurdle you need to cross. There's a hard exam that you need to get through and so on. And of course, the kid looks smarter after the kid gets into IIT because everyone there has to be smart. So maybe comparing an IITian with a non-IITian and making a statement could just be false, because it's probably not because of the IIT, it's probably because the kid was already smarter. So you need to look at these sort of issues. And the only way you can actually study this would be to randomly put some children in IIT, randomly put some children in another college, and then see if there's a difference between these two children. Then you can get an answer. But it's just ethically wrong. So can these questions be answered by an experiment? Yes, they can, but no, you cannot do it because it's just ethically wrong. And therefore, we don't have data for these sort of questions. So to give you an idea, in the past, people were allowed to do crazy sorts of experiments. So there was an experiment in the prison. So it was a fake prison where they just basically took some participants, put some of them as prisoners, and put some as the guards who are guarding the prison. And they let them like that for months, and they gave them different activities. And like halfway through the experiment, the guards who were supposed to be like the police were hitting the fake prisoners so much that they were bleeding, and they were some of them died. So it was actually very, very violent. So they were trying to study something using an experiment, but it was long, long ago, and there was not a lot of ethical code. That experiment obviously cannot be repeated today, but it was possible to do that in the past. And you need to look a little bit more at the ethical things. So I'll just give you a little bit of context here. So you're not allowed to lie to the participant at any cost. So that you should never lie to the participant. Even if it's for your experiment, like try as much as you can to avoid lying. And the other most important thing is that you need to always ask for their consent before the experiment starts. So we usually have something called a consent form. So these are just technical details that you need to know in case you do an experiment. So yeah, always get their consent. And obviously they need to be more than 18 years old. If they're less than 18 years old, their parents need to agree that the kid can take part in an experiment. Right. So experiments look pretty cool. Yeah, it's the Stanford prison experiment. So experiments look pretty cool in all these ways, but it's just that we need to have, if we have like a really, really advanced technology, unlimited resources, because experiments can be very expensive, and zero ethics, then every question can be answered to the maximum precision through an experiment. So if you need to know the exact value, an experiment is the best way to do it. But unfortunately, we don't have super advanced technology which can do anything. We don't have unlimited resources, and of course, we have ethics. So there are these limitations. There are also other limitations which we can handle. So these are limitations we cannot do anything about. There are some limitations here that we can handle. So what we would do is go through all of these problems that experiments face. So they're called heterogeneity, spillovers, attrition, and non-compliance. So we'll go through all 4 of them. There are, of course, a little other issues, but these are like the main issues that we usually face in an experiment. And we'll see how to deal with each of these issues. And yeah, so let's start with heterogeneity. Maybe before we go there, let's just see if there are some questions there about it. Okay, so someone talks about propensity score matching. That's like the closest result that we can get at the moment, because experiment is just unethical. But yeah, if you can do an experiment, that's like the best way to get the best result. But of course, propensity matching scores are like the closest you can get to the real value. Okay, so let's look at heterogeneity. So this is very similar to the example I gave earlier. So in case the Horlicks company decides to put children of tall parents in one group and children of short parents in another group, the children in both the groups are very different. So this problem is called heterogeneity. It's also called endogeneity. So it just means that the treatment and the control group are very different, and therefore will react differently to the treatment. So let's say there's a group of children whose parents have already taught them that helping other people is extremely important, and another group of people who haven't taught that to the children. And then you induce certain treatment, like showing a picture of a poor child and asking if they want to help the child. This child is going to react very differently to the other child, just because of some other inherent characteristics that the kids have that we don't know about. So there shouldn't be any differences in the pre-treatment value of the outcome. That's very important too. So let's imagine you just put tall kids in one group and short kids in one group. That's not a good experiment for starters, because there's just a lot of differences. So you need to make sure that there aren't any unobserved differences between the groups. Unobserved itself means it's not observed, so it's hard to control, of course. But you try as much as you can to avoid this issue, and we'll see how we can do that. So let's take an example here. Right. So let's assume this is, let's just look at this graph for starters. So if you look at this value, so this is the CGPA that the student got in the x-axis, and this is the salary that they earn after they finish their university degree in the y-axis. Then these dots are just data points. So if you look at this, what conclusion will you draw from this graph? So in the x-axis, there's CGPA. In the y-axis, there is the salary. Okay, so if you draw a normal regression line, this is what you'll get, right? So if you try to interpret it, so let's take this point. When the kid has, when the student has lower CGPA, the student gets a lot of salary. When the student has a lot of CGPA, the student gets lesser salary. So if you just draw this regression and show your students, they're probably going to decide that, okay, I shouldn't study, because if I don't study, then I get a higher salary. And this is actually a reflection from a true data. The data points are not exactly the same, correct ones, but it is the true data. But the problem is that this is from one university and this is from one university. These are like different institutions. And if you just draw a regression just for them, you'll see these data. So here within the university, of course, as your CGPA increases, your salary increases. So, but when you look at it this way, it's just wrong. So how do we deal with this? So these are issues that can also be faced in an experiment. So in case you put one of your group here, so you pick all of these students and put them in a group, and you pick all of these students and then put them in a group, your results are going to be messed up. Let's see with an example. So let's take a treatment, and the treatment is just that you give them 2 weeks of internship, which is just training during their studies. So you can do it in 3 different ways. Treatment is given to random participants from both university A and B. So you pick 2 or 3 students here, you pick 2 or 3 students here, and then give them an internship, and then compare them with whoever's left here. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to give the treatment to students of university A and put these people in the control group. Or you can put these people in the treatment group and you can put these people in the control group. So where do you think the treatment effect is biggest? So treatment effect is finding out if the internship worked. Where do you think the internship would have worked the best according to your outcome variables? So it can be in case A, where both the group gets the treatment, or is it in case 2, where A gets the treatment, or is it case 3, where B gets the treatment? So the treatment group is, let's say, their earnings or their outlook, whatever outcome. It can be how much they earn in the future or how successful they are. Right. So we're getting some answers. So some say in case 1. So the case 1 is where you get the real data. So you get the real value when you put people in the case 1, when you use case 1, because you've sort of divided this group into 2. Like you've divided both the group. So this is like the perfect way to do it. That's the actual value. Let's take case 2, for example. So you're just giving it to these. So to imagine this better, let's just take, this is Oxford University, and this is some local college. Okay. And now if you compare these two, you'll understand it. So if you study at Oxford University, even with a very low CGPA, and you're not going to get very high CGPA because teachers are just much more stricter there. You don't get higher marks that easily. But even with a low CGPA, salary is going to be extremely high. But let's say you study in a very normal college, like the most small college in your area, and you get a really high CGPA because your teachers are pretty generous, but your salary is not going to be so high. So with this image in your head, you can sort of understand this better. So you need to compare these two groups. You shouldn't probably put Oxford students in one group and normal students in another group. It's better to always split it, right? And the second case has that problem. So the treatment is given to students of Oxford University. So Oxford University students are given an extra internship, and then you see the results and compare it with this children. It sort of doesn't make sense now, right? These children are just going to perform so much better. And in case 3, you give an internship to this children and not to this children. And of course, their values would go up because now they have like better potential to earn more salary. But again, this is not reflecting the actual result. And in case we are underestimating it. So the treatment effect is biggest in case 2 because we are overestimating the result. And a lot of people have answered, thank you, and that's the correct answer. And case 1 is where we're getting the real data. That's where we get the actual value, and that's what we're supposed to do. So here you can understand how it can be a problem, right? So this is heterogeneity in case 2 and 3. In case you don't put them all together and then randomize them. You know, if you just put this group in one, this group in one, and then compare, it could be a problem. So do we observe this in real experiments? We actually do. So there are these studies which conduct an experiment in 2 states. So let's say they pick Karnataka and Kerala and do an experiment with putting Kerala in the control group and Karnataka in the treatment group. It's just a wrong way to do it because these 2 states have many, many other inherent characteristics, like maybe something like these 2 groups. So in each of the outcome variables, both the groups are very different. There's different culture and so on. So that's not a very good way to randomize it. So how do you randomize it? We'll see it a little later on how to randomize in that sort of cases. Right, so what happens when there's heterogeneity? We estimate the wrong value. So we either overestimate or we underestimate. And as we saw in this example, so here we overestimate in case 2, we underestimate in case 3. How do you get rid of heterogeneity? By proper randomization. So just randomizing everyone together and not with these clusters in place. And we can also use fixed effects. So what fixed effects basically does, I'm not going to go into the details, as I said, I'm skipping all the math part, but basically what fixed effects does is it reduces this difference. So it basically brings both this group to the same level. Or the other way to call it is controlling for the cluster here. And in this case, it's the university. So you're controlling for the university, and that's exactly what a fixed effects does. It just makes you compare all the data together. So you can use a fixed effects in case of heterogeneity. Is there any questions here? Okay, great. We don't have any questions. That's good. If you have any questions, just feel free to drop it in the chat. I'll look at it once in a while. So then let's move on to the next issue we could face. It's spillovers. And after spillovers, we'll take a really short break and come back. So hold on if you feel like taking a break now. So great. So spillovers happens when there are some subjects who are either in the treatment group or in the control group and either don't get the treatment completely or get the treatment when you're supposed to be in the control group. I'll give you an example and then go back to the definition again. So let's take an example of some preschool kids. So let's say you are teaching a new subject, let's say astronomy to first standard kids. So that's your treatment. So let's say you talk about stars, you talk about the sun and how the world works and so on to first standard kids and see if they think differently. And that's the treatment. So you teach it to some of the children in the school. And you know for a fact that when they go home, they're going to play with each other. The treatment group is going to play with the control group as well. And they're going to talk to each other. And when they talk to each other, they talk about all sorts of things. So they're going to talk about how they learned that the sun is a star and whatever. And there's going to be some sort of knowledge transfer from the treatment group to the control group. And we also observe this in a lot of other cases. So if you, in case you want to give the treatment of people reading a book, people always share such things, right? Like people share their books with others. So if you give them a book, they would read it. Their friends might read it. So it happens in a way where the treatment spills over to the control group. So subjects who are not in the treatment group are basically the subjects in the control group. So they might also get the treatment partially or fully because of their locality. So it's possible that it's just because they're close, because of their connection. They could be siblings, they could be friends with the subjects in the treatment group. So this is how treatment spills over. We'll see a little more examples here and then move there. So let's say there are two different cities. This is very similar to the example I gave you. So let's say this is a city, and you want to test something. One way to do it is put city 1 in one group and city 2 in another group. So you can put one in the treatment, one in the control. And what is the issue we'd face here? We'd face heterogeneity, right? So the first issue that we saw, these two groups might be inherently different. So let's say this is Kerala, this is Karnataka. Of course, it doesn't look to one group and not to the other group. There's so many differences. You cannot do that. So how do you handle this? You can like randomize everyone in the group and just put this person can be in the treatment, control, and so on. But again, there's a problem of spillovers. They're close to each other, so they talk to each other. And so your treatment might get spilled over to the control group. So how do you handle this? Right, so this is one way to do it. Instead of splitting it based on the city, you split it somewhere like this in the middle. So one side gets the treatment, the other side gets the control. So here we sort of handle the heterogeneity issue and the spillover issue, right? So this is what spillover is. So it basically means that because the people in the treatment group interact with the control group, the treatment basically spills over to the control group. And you can imagine why that's an issue. So let's try to answer this question. Sorry, this is not a group task. This is from my course, so it's an individual task. So let's say you detect a spillover in your treatment. And which of this is true? Do you overestimate the result, or do you underestimate the result, or do you correctly estimate the result? I'll give you another example of spillover. So this is a very interesting research. So the research was just about political campaigns. So it's you all know that it's so important to get people to vote, and there aren't a lot of incentives for people to vote. So I know that a lot of us would also potentially skip voting. So people use a lot of techniques to make people take part in elections. So one of them is making them feel guilty about it, telling them it's a duty of every citizen to vote, using heroes like actors and sports stars to talk about the importance of voting. And some other ways of doing it, I'll talk about one such example tomorrow or day after tomorrow. But another one was where they put on these campaign boards. So basically it's just like posters in India. So they put these boards in the US in certain areas. And people in that area voted more because of the boards, but also people in the nearby area also voted more because people drive through different areas. So if you live in a locality, you also drive through the neighboring locality and you look at the treatment. So this is an example of spillover. So the neighboring region people also got the treatment just because of their locality. Okay, great. We have some answers. We have some people who say B, some who say A. So let's see what happens. So in this example, it's very clear that, I don't know if I can use a pen here. Yeah, okay. So let's say this is the value of, this is where group A was, and this is where group B was. Okay, and after you get a treatment, your value changes. So let's say you were given the boards and now you started voting more. This is where you were voting earlier. You were voting at like some 5% people are voting. Now some 15% are voting. And this is the neighboring region, which you thought was the control region, but they also ended up seeing the billboards and the posters. So they also started voting. So this is one case, right? And the other case is where there is no spillovers. So let me draw that as well, so you have an idea of how it looks like. So this is the normal value, and in this case, we don't have any sort of spillovers. So this group grows here, and since there is no effect here, this is the value that they have. Right, so if you look at the differences between these two values, I don't know, let's take this color. So from here till here is what we call the treatment effect. So this is the treatment effect. And in this example, this is the treatment effect. So this is when we have spillovers. This is when we don't have spillovers. So this is the actual value of what it should have been, because we always want to not have spillovers. But here, what happens when we have spillovers? The control group, this is the control group, this is the treatment group. The control group also gets some treatment, right? So do we overestimate is making it bigger, underestimate is making it smaller. So if you look at it, it's now very clear that we're underestimating it, right? Yeah, exactly. So it's A is the correct answer. So it's underestimating. So someone has a question. So how do we avoid this, especially when we are measuring the outcomes of government schemes? It's extremely hard to make sure that there's no spillovers. But for example, in case you're measuring, let's just take an example. So let's say you're measuring what happens when government gives people bicycles. And that's an actual government scheme in India, right? And the problem is that when you give bicycles to people, a lot of people try to study this scheme. But the thing is, if I get a bicycle, of course, I'm going to share it with my sister who did not get the treatment, and she's in the control group, but I'm going to share it with her, right? And these sort of things cannot be controlled. But I'll tell you how it can be handled. You cannot control for spillovers, but you can handle it. This is one way to do it, splitting it. So instead of giving to half of the children in each school, which is also ethically wrong because it just creates jealousy, what you can do it is to give to children from different areas. So let's say schools in this areas gets bicycle this year, and the next schools get it in the next year. So they will also get it, so they don't have to feel jealous. But it's just that these people got it earlier, so you can consider them as treated and then compare the values. So that's sort of the way we handle it. The other way we handle it is this. So this is called spillover blocks. So let's say this green are the ones who got the treatment. So anyone who's green got the treatment, and just imagine this as a locality. So these regions got the treatment. So what you basically do is create an area around each treatment which does not get any treatment. So these are called spillover blocks. These weird faces are the spillover blocks. So they do not get any treatment, but you know that this treatment is going to spill over to them. And you keep your control group safely away from the treatment group. So what you're doing is just basically creating some distance between the treatment and the control so that we minimize the spillovers as much as possible, right? And yeah, I hope you understood till here. So we'll take a quick break. Let's get back here in 3 minutes. So in the meanwhile, like right after the break, I'll answer your questions. So also feel free to ask some questions. So let's take a 3-minute break, and I'll see you back in 3 minutes then. All right, then let's start the talk again. But before we move on, I'm just going to quickly answer some questions. So someone asked a question about using twins to avoiding genetic differences, and that's true. A lot of experiments do use twins, so that's actually a very good idea. But it's just that it's very hard to get these twins, and most of these studies have like a sample size of like 1,000, 2,000, and to get so many twins is just much more expensive, which is why we don't do it. And someone asked how covariate balance is done, and they asked if it's just making sure that the mean and the variance is similar in both the groups, and that's exactly the correct answer. So what you basically do is you take multiple values like gender, education, the exposure to something, religion, whatever. You take all these factors and just make sure that the mean and the variance is similar in both the groups. Can't we use clustering here and check whether the two clusters belong to particularly different universities? Yes, that's exactly what we spoke about after that. So there are two clusters, and you need to just control for the clusters. And someone mentioned that the spillover is like ring fencing the treatment group, and that's true. Would a pre-post design be better in terms of managing spillover? So yeah, we will talk a little bit about pre-post design. So pre-post design is what we call the within participant design. And so far we've been talking about something called the between participant design. It's between participant because a participant gets the treatment and some participants don't get the treatment. So it's between two participants. And the other way to handle it is when the same participant gets it a little while later. So what you see is before and after. So let's take an example of reading a book. So you try to find out what a person's perspective is, make them read a book, and then see if it has changed, basically. So that's one way to do it. And it does manage spillovers, but of course it has a little other issues because it's the same person and they might have not just read the book, they might have spoken to someone in the meanwhile, they might have read some other stuff. So it's a little hard to control for that. So someone spoke about, isn't it better to have a heterogenic group? Yes, I think there's a little confusion here. So heterogenic group is good. So you need a group which comprises of very similar characteristics as the population. So the sample should represent the population, but both the groups should be similar. That's what we mean by heterogeneity issue. It's just group A and group B. The treatment group and the control group should be similar to each other. And they should also be similar to the population, and they can be as varied as possible. Stanford prison experiment wouldn't have gotten the same results if we were ethical about it, isn't it? Yeah, the Stanford experiment wouldn't have gotten the same results because, for starters, it shouldn't be done, and I mean, would not be allowed to be done. And secondly, it would have stopped people. If it was done, the researchers would have stopped them much in advance. Before it got dirty. So yeah, and isn't placebo almost the same thing? Placebo is a little different. We will talk about that in this talk as well, but not right now. Okay, and someone asked for some experiments related to investors. So I'm just going to send a video in the chat, which is another talk I gave a few weeks back, and it's about behavioral finance, and it covers topics on investment and so on. So maybe you could watch that thing. So okay, great. So I've shared it in the chat, and hopefully it'll also be shared in the YouTube chat. And let's proceed then. Great. So we spoke about two different issues that can be faced. And now let's move on to talk about the other issues that can be faced. So let's take non-compliance. So non-compliance is when someone is in the treatment group, but they're not taking the treatment, or they're in the control group and they are taking the treatment. So let's take an example, the book reading example. So let's say your treatment is just reading a book, and you put people in group A to read the book, group B to not read the book. But you can never control people. You cannot never force people to read a book, and you can definitely never force people to not read a particular book. So let's say I wrote a book and I'm trying to see if it changed people's thinking. I can never force other people to not buy my book, right? And if I end up telling them don't buy that book and never read it, they're definitely going to read it. So that's like the worst way to do it. So there's not much you can do. So what happens is that people in the control group to whom I gave the book might or might not like the book. So there's a chance that they do not read the book in the end, but the people in the control group might end up reading the book. So this is called non-compliance, which basically means that the people are not complying with whichever group they are allotted to. They're not complying to the treatment. And this is extremely common in medical trials. So medical trials, let's say I create a new kind of paracetamol and I want to test it. And I give it to some people and I don't give it to some people. And the problem is that people often are scared of medicines, but it's well paid. So let's say you get 2,000 rupees if you test one paracetamol that I made and make sure that tell me what all symptoms you face after that. The problem is that a lot of people act like they take the medicine in, but they don't actually take the medicine in. And you can see how this can be a problem, right? So you end up not giving the treatment to everyone in the treatment, or giving the treatment to some people in the treatment. It's less likely in a medical experiment in the control group because they just don't get access to your medicine. So there are two types of non-compliance. One is binary or partial non-compliance. So binary is when the person either takes part in the treatment or doesn't take part in the treatment. It's simple as that. So you either take the tablet or don't take the tablet. Partial is when they can sort of partially take part in it. So for example, reading a book, it's not like you read the book or you did not read the book. There's also a phase in between where you sort of read half of the book, right? So that's partial non-compliance. And why do people not comply? So there are two different reasons: random non-compliance and non-random non-compliance. So let's just assume that during the experiment, I was super busy and I was in the treatment where I was supposed to read the book, but I really did not find time on that day to read the book. I was sick, I got sick or something. That is random non-compliance. I did not plan to be non-compliant, but I just ended up being non-compliant because of various reasons. So this is not random, and non-random is when I know that this is a medicine which I don't want to take and I'm not complying to it. So this is a bigger problem, as you can see, because people select into it or not select into it. So everyone who got the treatment, who actually got the treatment, are people who decided that they are willing to take the risk, and everyone who backed out were people who did not want to take the risk. So here, the two groups are not similar anymore. But if it's just random, then it just means that they just randomly did not take it. So what happens when people don't comply? So again, when we had this covariate balance initially, that becomes a little questionable, right? So because you wanted to make sure both the groups were very similar, but now let's say the treatment was going for a 5-kilometer run every week. So every Monday you go 5-kilometer run. And let's say half of the people in the treatment group just did not go. Now the two groups are very different because only motivated people ended up doing the treatment, right? So the two groups, the randomization becomes questionable now. So this is the issue that we face when there's non-compliance. Before we go to how we deal with non-compliance, let's see what the types of compliers are. So there are some people who always take the treatment. So this is very specific to experiments, of course. So anyone who takes the treatment always is called always takers. So even if you put them in the treatment group or in the control group, they always take the treatment. And there's this group of people called never takers. They never take the treatment. So if you put them in the treatment group or in the control group, they just don't take the treatment. There are some people called compliers. These are the people we really like as experimenters because they stick to what you give them. So if you put them in the treatment group, they take the treatment. If you put them in the control group, they don't take the treatment. So they're the nice people that we like. Defiers are the worst kind of people because if you put them in the treatment, they're not going to take the treatment. But if you put them in the control group, they're going to take the treatment. So this is like the worst kind of people. So these are not inherent characteristics of people, obviously, but it's just that in each experiment you conduct, there are some people who just defiers, compliers, never takers, always takers. And if you look at it, you can see how when an always taker is put in a treatment group, it's not a problem for you because they were supposed to take the treatment in the treatment group and they're an always taker, so they took the treatment. But only when they put in a control group, it becomes a problem. It's the same here. When these people are in the control group, there is no problem because they shouldn't take the treatment and they're not taking the treatment. But when you put them in the treatment group, it becomes a problem. These people are not a problem anywhere. These people are a problem everywhere. So, which is why I said we do not like them. Okay, let's look at a quick video example because it sort of helps us understand how the calculation that we're going to do in the next part. So we're going to look at a little bit of little numbers. It's not hard. I'll explain everything, but I think it's very important concept, so we will do it. But to give you a background of the study, I'll just show you a quick video. Tell me if you can't hear it or something.
That's a new cancer treatment that she thinks is as good, if not better, than the current treatment. To find out if it is better, she needs to test it. The new treatment is called treatment A, and the current treatment, treatment B. She asks people with cancer to take part in a trial to compare the treatments, and gives one group the new treatment and the other the current treatment. To make sure there is no bias, the groups need to be as similar as possible. So the groups need to have a similar age range of people, they need to have similar general health, and to have had similar treatments. If the two groups are too different, it might affect the results. Also, neither Dr. Brown nor the patients can choose which treatment they have. If Dr. Brown shows, she may subconsciously put the sicker patients into the current treatment group and give the new treatment to the fitter people, making the new treatment look as if it worked better when it really didn't. So to prevent bias, Dr. Brown puts the details of those taking part into a special computer program, and that randomly allocates them to either treatment A or treatment B. This means that the people taking part in the trial have treatments that are suitable for them and that will help the doctor to find out if the new treatment works better than the current one.
Great. And as we discussed earlier, you now know how people can end up not complying in certain conditions. So we'll now look at an example to see how it can be handled. Okay, great. So let's say there are these two groups, control and the treatment group. Let's say everybody in the control group complied, because it's very hard to get a medicine which someone has developed. So let's say everybody complied. But in the treatment group, let's say only 80% of the treatment group complied, 20% did not. So, I mean, usually how do we ask it? We can ask some control questions. So, for example, in medical trials, sometimes they ask people to not drink water, but just eat it. And then they ask how it tasted, basically. So, questions like that can sort of give you an idea if they read the book or not, and sorry, if they took the medicine or not. And in the book example, you can basically ask them questions from the book, and if they answer everything or most questions correct, then you know that they read the book. If not, you can decide they did not read the book. That's sort of how you get to that. But let's say we know that 80% took the treatment, 20% did not in the treatment group. So this is sort of how it would look like, and we'll see why we did this, put these numbers in a little later. But before we go there, we'll see what are the different ways to deal with non-compliance. So one is assume random compliance. So here, it's like the example I gave you earlier, someone was just sick and they couldn't read the book or something like that. Or they thought they took the medicine, but they just forgot. So you can sort of assume random compliance in some cases. So in this situation, what we do is we just drop the data. So we basically just drop the data and we assume that nothing happened. We assume that it doesn't affect our data, and so on. The other way to do it is to assume intention to treat. It's not an assumption, sorry. You consider it as an intention to treat. So what it means that I intended to treat you. That's everyone in the treatment group. So let's say I gave everyone in the treatment group a book, and everyone in the control group were not given a book. So here the treatment is not reading the book. The treatment is getting the opportunity to read the book, or getting a book to read. It's not reading the book, because you cannot force people to actually read the book, right? It's quite hard. You can do it, but it's really hard. So what we do is not give them the treatment, but it's the intention to treat. So I intend to treat these people. So what you do is that you get a treatment effect, which is basically just based on intention to treat and not the real value. So you don't have to do a lot of math here. You just tell in case you're doing a research and publishing it, you just basically tell them that, this is intention to treat and not the actual treatment effect. The other way to deal with it is instrumental variable analysis. We're not going to talk about instrument variables here, because that would need an assumption that you are very strong and you understand linear regression and the assumptions. But I'll give you a little idea and you can read about it later. I can give you other resources as well. Okay, so let's look at this. So here we are assuming random compliance. So random compliance is that if somebody did not take the study, it just means it's for no important reason. So non-compliance is random. So it's similar to tossing a coin and deciding if I should take the treatment or not, which means I basically have no control, and it's not controlled based on some very specific factor. It's very random factor. So let's say we take this example. So in the control group, we said everyone took it. In the treatment group, only 80% took it. So anyone who complied we call it enrolled. And let's say this is the result you get. So 45% of people who took the new treatment have a reduction in cancer. We don't care about this because these people did not even take the treatment. And in the control group, 20% of people had reduction in treatment. This is the old treatment, and this is the new treatment that the lady gave. These people were supposed to take the new treatment, but they did not. So what you do is you just drop these people, you just drop this 20% of the people, and you just compare these two values. So 45 minus 20, 25. So this becomes the treatment effect. So what we've done is we've just dropped the missing value. So this is called assuming random compliance. The other way to do it, and this is like a more common way to do it, is called intention to treat. So here, instead of giving people the treatment itself, you give them the option of getting the treatment. And the way we do it is slightly different. So in the treatment group, again, we have 80% enrolled, 20% not enrolled. What you do is you just calculate the overall. So overall is adjusted to the percentage here. Yeah, it is. And so the overall is 41%. And in the control group, as we saw, it's 20% reduction in cancer. So in the treatment group, there's a 41% reduction in cancer. Therefore, your treatment effect becomes 21%. And if you compare it here it's 25% because you just dropped this value. Here, you're not dropping this value because everyone in this treatment group got the option of getting the treatment. They just chose not to. And this reflects reality a bit more because, if a government gives people a bicycle to use, you cannot force people to use a bicycle. It's just that they were given a bicycle. It's like you intended to treat them. If they got treated or not was their own choice, right? So this sort of reflects reality a bit better. So this is the instrument variable analysis. As I mentioned, I'm just going to skip it. But all you need to know is that if you already know what an instrument variable analysis is, I'll just quickly explain how we deal with it here. So here the instrument variable is just getting treatment. So because when you assign to the treatment is the instrument, because assignment to the treatment affects you getting the treatment directly. So this is considered to be a good instrument here. And I'm going to leave it right here. I'll give you some readings for ones who are interested, but let's not get into the math in a video call. So let's move on. Okay, so this is the last issue that we're going to talk about. It's called attrition. So people often tend to confuse attrition with non-compliance. So we'll also in the end see how it's different. So attrition is when a participant leaves the experiment in the middle of an experiment. So this usually happens not when the experiment is one shot, not when it's just a 1 hour experiment, but rather when the participants have to come every week for 5 weeks, or today and then next month or something like that. So it's very common when the experiment runs over a period of time. And as you can imagine, the attrition rate is directly proportional to the duration of the experiment. So as the experiment gets longer and longer, not in terms of one time, but in terms of the number of times they need to attend the session, the attrition keeps increasing. So here again, we'll use the cancer drug study to see how it works. But before we get there, let's see how attrition is different from non-compliance. Oh, there's actually a very interesting thing here. So in a lot of these medical trials, the sad truth is that a lot of participants end up dying in the middle of the experiment, or they get too sick to take part in the study anymore. So let's say you are conducting a cancer study. It's possible that some of your participants die in the middle of the experiment. So if they lose their life in the middle, then of course they can't continue with their experiment. So that is also considered to be attrition. Or sometimes it's just because the person moved from the city or something. But this is like an extreme case. So we'll see how attrition is different from non-compliance. So attrition is when the participant leaves in the middle of an experiment. Non-compliance is when the person is still sitting in the experiment and they're just not taking your medicine. They're just not reading your book. They're just not complying to your treatment. So often in experiments, in behavioral economics experiments, which we'll talk about in depth later, is that people sit in the lab, but you really can't control them. So often here, I live in Switzerland. So here in Switzerland, you can never force people to give their phone before the experiment. It's possible in India, but it's not. So often during the experiment, you see people just texting or watching a video or something. And it's really hard to make sure that they get treated properly because you cannot control a lot of things, right? And this is non-compliance. But attrition is different. Attrition is when the person basically does not give you any data anymore. So the easiest way to see it is that in attrition, there's no final data available. In non-compliance, there is still data available. They just did not comply. So moving on, there are 4 M's. These are the causes of attrition. Some author put it in a nice way. So first is motivation. So the participant has to be motivated to take part in an experiment, right? So which could be hard sometimes in case, let's say you're asked to attend a 1-hour session every 2 weeks for a year. Of course, halfway through you lose your motivation to attend. Let's say you're paid 100 rupees per session, and at some point you just say, okay, I don't want to do this anymore, right? It happens. Mobility is when you just basically cannot travel there because of certain reasons. It could be, often it's because of a natural calamity. So in case there's an earthquake or a landslide or something, of course, people cannot take part in the experiment anymore. So that's quite common too. Morbidity is when somebody gets sick and therefore cannot take part in an experiment. And mortality is when some of your participant passes away, so they cannot continue the experiment. And before we move on, like there are ways to deal with it. So before the experiments, try to motivate people. Do not conduct an experiment in an area where you think something is going to happen in the future. So if there is like a heavy rain coming and you know that there's potential flooding, then maybe you shouldn't do the experiment then. And these are conditions that you sort of cannot control, especially if you're doing a medical treatment or if you're doing any sort of mix-up of behavioral economics and biology, which involves treatment, which could be injections or something that's taken in. So here it's very common it's also common that we do it on people who are already sick. So it's potentially possible that the person gets sick or the person loses their life. But not necessarily because of your treatment, but maybe just generally. Okay, so there are 2 types of attrition rates that we talk about, and I want you to listen to this carefully because we're going to talk about it a little in detail. This is the 1D methods part that we will be covering properly. So overall attrition rate is when the proportion of sample members randomly assigned to the study groups for whom the outcome data is not available. So overall attrition rate is just the percentage of people in the overall experiment who left the study. So it's not specific to any treatment. Differential attrition rate is the difference in the attrition rate in the treatment and the control group. So this is basically between the 2 groups. So we're trying to see if the treatment group people left more often than the control group treatment. Why is this interesting? The differential attrition rate is interesting to see if your treatment is just painful. So if the control is doing nothing and the treatment is watching a very traumatic video every day, and you see that people in the treatment group are just leaving the study, you sort of know why they're leaving the study, because they don't feel comfortable. And this could be an issue because the people who left the study are very different from the ones who decided to stay till the end, right? They are the people who do not feel any sort of negative emotions based on the traumatic video. So anyone who had very similar traumatic experience in the past, or anyone who's sensitive to traumatic events, would have left the study. So the group is not great anymore. So, which is why differential attrition is a bigger problem than overall attrition rate. So overall attrition is when people leave the experiment, like overall. So we'll look at this. We'll see why mean that this is considered to be more important. So this area is considered to be a good experiment, or an experiment where the results can be valid. And this red area is bad. So if you look at this, here you see the overall attrition rate. So in overall attrition rate, you can see that until here there's green, until 50% there's green. In differential attrition rate, right around like 7%, green stops, which sort of talks about how important this value is, how important the value being low is, right? So I put this graph mainly for that reason. So when the difference between your treatment and the control group gets little different than that, it's already considered to be too high level of attrition, and you should look at your data and probably do something about it. So we'll sort of see how the calculation works. It's again just simple addition multiplication, and percentages. So now let's look at it quickly. So this is the number of participants in treatment group. This is the number of participants in control group. This is the overall number of participants. And this is the attrition rate in treatment group, and this is the attrition rate in control group, overall attrition rate. So now let's look at the first one. So this is the treatment group. And let's assume this is the cancer study. This is the first round, and these people had to come after, let's say, 2 months. This is after another 2 months. So in round one, there, of course, there cannot be any attrition because these are the people who started the study. And in round two, from 50, it became 45. So how much attrition percentage people have left? How much attrition do we have? How much percentage of people have left? From 50 to 45 means there's 10% attrition, right? And again, nobody has left here, so we need to compare this only with the first group. So again, there's 10% attrition here. So we put 10% and 10%. Now let's do the same thing for the control group. So in this control group, from 50, it became 45. So again, 10% attrition. And from 50, it became 40. So 20% attrition here. Okay, so this is the overall attrition. Again, let's do the same thing. From 100, it became 90. It's 10% attrition. From 100, it became 85, 15% attrition. Great. So we already have these values. So what we're doing here is basically just adding another row for differential attrition rate. So we're adding this differential attrition rate, where again, we just need to compare the treatment group and the control group, right? So what's the difference between this treatment group and the control group? Nothing. There's 0% difference. Here again, it's 0%, 0%, and here we see a 10% difference. So that's the differential attrition rate. So 10% here, 0% here, and 0% here. So now these are the two interesting values for us, right? Overall attrition rate and differential attrition rate. So let's just take these two values and put it here. So we have overall and differential attrition rate. Let's take this graph again and see how it looks here. So first is 0%, 0%, perfect. It's here, it's in the green region. And round two is 10% and 0%. So 10% here and 0% here. Again, great. And the second group is 15% and 10%. So 15%, good so far, but 10% is not accepted for differential attrition rate. So this is how it looks. So this is okay, but this is not okay. So what you have to do is you have to use only this data. You can only use round one and round two because round three is here. Or you can try to come up with some ways of handling this, which we will see as well. Do we have any questions so far? The reason for attrition itself can be an important conclusion for the experiment. Yeah, exactly. The attrition value can be extremely important when you make arguments in your paper itself, yeah, for your results. Okay, so great. So let's see why attrition is an issue. I already spoke about this quite a lot because it's extremely important and something that you really, really need to know when you conduct an experiment. And everything that we have covered so far are some stuff that you really need to know when you conduct any sort of experiment. Okay, so let's move on. So attrition bias. Again, as I said, when people who prematurely exit a study are fundamentally different from those who remain in the study. So very similar to the sensitive example that I gave you. So people who remain in the study are different from the ones who left. So here you no longer have a representative sample for starters because they don't represent the population. And there's also no internal validity. We'll see what an internal validity is a little later, but it basically just means that your data is not valid anymore because you're not comparing the right sort of groups. So we saw how attrition can be in cancer drug studies, so that people can die. And again, if you look at it, people who were weak have a higher chance of dying, right? So if your results are very promising, but there's a high attrition in your treatment group, you might want to consider the research. You might want to reconsider your product that you created because it's possible that it may work very well on strong patients, but the weak patients have died. That's not what you want. So yeah, so again, attrition rate can be very useful, but yeah, this is how it happens in medical research. Often people get sick or apart from the normal reasons. And in normal psychology studies and research, sometimes if you started your experiment, but there's a huge budget constraint at some point, which is happening a lot during this COVID time because people planned for a particular budget, but everything just got more expensive because of COVID. And what do you do now? You already conducted 3 sessions with 200 participants, but you no longer have money for 200 participants. So what we basically do is try to cut down the numbers, right? So we're like, okay, for the 3rd and the 4th round, we have 100 participants. And again, if you just cancel people from one particular city, that's not great. So what you need to do is randomly cancel participants. So that's also attrition. And attrition is a major issue because of 2 different things. One is called survivorship bias and the other one is failure bias. So survivorship bias is what I mentioned here. So it's when only the subjects who survived the process are in the analysis. So let's say you're showing a traumatic video, only people who survived going through the traumatic video, who decided to go for it, are the ones who are in the final data. Anyone who decided to not survive did not go through it or could not survive. So it can be both. People can choose to leave or they just don't have a choice, so they're leaving. And it's the same thing with cancer drug study example. So if a person actually died, they basically did not survive here. And failure bias is when people who have failed the process are included. It doesn't mean the person is a failure, it just means the person did not fail the particular process. In behavioral economics, we do have some terms which are very controversial, very similar to irrationality, which you saw yesterday and day before yesterday. It's just not a nice term. In the same way, failure bias doesn't mean the person is a failure. So for example, let's say you are conducting a study in an unemployment office. So a place where all unemployed people come to collect some money or something, and you're conducting a study there. And once a person gets a job, they're no longer going to come to your study, right? So anyone who is staying for all 10 sessions are people who did not get job throughout the 10 sessions. So anyone who failed a particular process, here the process is getting a job, are now in your data. Anyone who did not fail the process are not in your data anymore. So these are all biases that you need to look out for as well, which are related to attrition. Okay, so let's take a small break after this, but let's just finish this part. So what can you do when there is this sort of attrition? So one is ex ante. So what can you do before the experiment is run? So one thing you can do is increase the incentives for subsequent meetups. So what you basically do here is that this is extremely common, and I see it all the time in our labs here. So if there is 2 sessions, in the first session, the participant is told you'll get 100 rupees, but in the second session, you'll get 1,000 rupees. So of course, everyone's going to come for the second session now because the incentives are just much higher for the subsequent sessions. And there are also some researchers who do this thing where they basically say you get 100 rupees every session, but you attended all the sessions, then you get 1,000 rupees in the end. So then, yeah, there is some incentive to attend all the sessions, right? And we wouldn't want to leave the money just like that. And try not to make the first few sessions unpleasant or hard. So try to make it as nice as possible, interesting as possible. And sometimes participants just move. So basically, let's say they live in a particular city, they move to a different city. Then you just try to track down your participants. It's sometimes hard to find them, but it's possible. And after the experiment is run, what can you do? If you think the attrition is independent of the outcomes, which means that the attrition is just random, then you can just drop the values and you can move on, which is very similar to random compliance we saw in non-compliance. In the same way, attrition can also be just independent, right? So if somebody moves to a different city, then you can't do much there. The other way to handle it is bounds analysis. I don't think we have enough time for that. If we cover all of that, then we will not have enough time in the end for questions. So I'll quickly go through it, but not go in depth. But I think it's explained clearly here. Yeah, there's a slide there, so you can look at it later as well. So what happens here is that we find a bound, which is definitely within which the value should lie in. So let's just look at it here, and I'll try to draw it and show. So let's say this is the number line. Not a line, but it's okay. So, okay. So let's say this is a number line and you're trying to show your data here. So let's say you have your control. This is the number line for your treatment is here now, but there is some sort of attrition here. And the attrition people have left the experiment. So those people could have reacted positively to the treatment, they could have reacted negatively to the treatment. So what you basically do is consider the best possible case and the worst possible case for the rest of them and create a bound. So you tell that the data has to lie between this and this. So you basically create a bound. And let's say if your control variable is here and this is your treatment variable, so then you can already see that this is pretty good, right? So let's look at this example. So here, 45% of people have reduction in cancer in the enrolled group. So in the treatment group, which is the new drug the lady designed in the video you saw, 45% of people have a reduction in cancer, which is really good. And in the control group, there's just 20% of people who have reduction in cancer. But the problem is 20% of people, you don't know what happened to them. They left the experiment. So what you do is you assume the worst possible case. The worst possible case is 0%, right? So the worst possible case is that 0% of people have reduction in cancer. And the best possible case is that all 100% of people have a reduction in cancer. I'm so sorry about my handwriting here. Okay, great. So this is the best and the worst possible case. And you calculate what would be for like the whole group. And let's say this is where you started. This was the 45% here. But you also need to add the other 20% of people. So they could, if it was like somewhere on this side, the value would be here. But if it was somewhere on this side, the value would be somewhere here. So what you do is that you just calculate the best and the worst possible case and create a bound within which the value has to lie. And if your control variable is still lower than that, then you need to be happy because your treatment is definitely working. Okay, great. So, okay, let's just finish one slide and then take a quick break. So what else do you need to keep in mind while designing an experiment? We already saw that how you need to decide what your target population is. So you need to already decide who your population should be. So let's take the example of the cancer study. So you can already decide that I'm just studying elderly people, cancer in elderly people, and I'm only studying skin cancer, and it can be very specific like that. And in the same way in behavioral economics, again, you can just decide that I'm studying people from rural parts of India who have had at least education until class 5. So it can be extremely specific like that. Or people who have been through traumatic events in the past and can speak their mother tongue, can speak only their mother tongue. So it can be extremely specific like that. But it's just that whatever population you pick, your sample should represent the population. So again, for this, you need to read about sampling methods, and that will give you a better idea of how sampling can be done. And I'll quickly cover these concepts. So these are all, again, things that you really, really need to know. And as you can see, I'm trying to cover 2 semester long course in 2 hours. So there's a lot, but I hope that this helps you whenever you conduct an experiment in the future. And I assume that after this 2 hours, you will be ready to conduct your own experiment, whatever it can be. Okay, so again, we saw about within subject design and between subject design a bit. So within subject is the before-after analysis, where you just give the treatment to a person and then see how the person was before the treatment was given and after. And between subject is when you give treatment to some people and not to some other people and then compare between them. The negative of this is basically time series data. So it's with time, a lot of things could change. And I'll talk about validity and then talk about single blind and double blind. So validity, I already spoke about internal validity. Internal validity basically means that whatever data you have found is the correct data. So your experiment doesn't have problems like heterogeneity, like spillovers, or all the 4 problems we discussed, non-compliance, attrition. So it doesn't have any of those problems, and the study is proper, then it's called internally valid. And external validity is when you can expand the study to another person. So let's say you conduct a study in a particular city. Let's say you conduct the study in Trivandrum. Can the results be applied in Chennai? Can the results be applied in Bangalore? So that is called external validity. Is the study externally valid? And if it's externally valid, it's completely okay if it's not externally valid, but you should just mention until when it can be externally valid. So if you conduct a study in different cities and rural parts of Kerala, you can say that the study is externally valid within Kerala, but it's not externally valid outside. So what we often do in behavioral economics, and you really need to be careful about this, is that a lot of research in behavioral economics took place in Europe and the US. Very little has been done in India. So all these subjects are from Europe and the US, and you clearly know how different we are from people in Europe and the US, right? Anyone from India is very, very different, and from other developing countries. So they're not very externally valid, but we are applying all of those results in our policies. That's not a great way to do it. So if someone is interested in research, you also can just replicate the study that has been done here in the Western world in India, and to just make it more externally valid in India, because we react very differently. So you sort of see what is external validity, right? So some results are just valid all over. So for example, giving money to charity, looking at a picture, not looking at a picture, might or might not be very different. So for example, if you compare two countries which are very similar, like more similar than India and Western countries, like let's say Germany and Austria, it's possible that you can do the experiment in Germany and apply it in Austria. But that's not the case between Germany and India. We are very different, right? So you need to look how externally valid a result is before you apply it. And single blind and double blind is this interesting concept where single blind is where the participants don't know each other, so there's still anonymity. So in most experiments, we have anonymous people, right? We don't talk about who is whom. I think you already saw a little bit about basic games in behavioral economics. I'm not sure what you covered yesterday, but I think you would have seen some experiments which the professor spoke about, where you can see that there are people interacting with each other. And in most of these interactions, they don't tell who they're interacting through, right? They just interact through a computer, and it's completely anonymous. So that's single blind. So the people who are taking part in the experiment don't know each other. But it's possible that the experimenter, whoever is conducting it, usually the researcher, knows who is whom. But double blind is when even the experimenter doesn't know who is whom. So this is done in very sensitive experiments. For example, let's say the experiment is about something like casteism or racism, or about something very personal, about wife battering, about other sexual harassments. Then you don't want the participants to feel uncomfortable, right? So you want it to keep it completely double blind. So in such cases, you try to make it double blind. The way people do it is often by not giving the payments directly, but just putting the payment in an envelope and leaving it outside with just the numbers, and giving it to the person based on the number and not based on their name or anything. So it can be made completely double blind. And whatever's inside the envelope is not known by the experimenter, but it's rather done by someone in a different room. So you could create all sorts of ways to make it completely double blind. And a lot of double blind experiments are often online. So most of these online experiments where you can just sit at home and do it are usually double blind. And tomorrow I will also show you some ways in which you can conduct experiments online if you don't have time today. I think I have it on my slide today, but if you don't have time, we'll do it tomorrow. I would suggest we skip this break and just proceed for another 10 minutes and then have some questions in the end. So I'll just quickly go through this. So there are some things called the lab experiments, there are field experiments, there's lab in the field experiments, and there are natural experiments. So lab experiments are basically experiments that are conducted in the lab. And it's in a very controlled environment. You can even control things like how much light is given, how much the temperature is, and so on, how quiet the room is, what music is played. You can control everything in the lab, right? And here it's very unspecific subjects. So usually it's just university students. Almost all of the research that we have right now is based on university students and not based on real people. And it has very high internal validity because you can control everything. But it has very low external validity because it's university students, and it doesn't probably represent the normal population. It's the cheapest option because you can pay very little to students and they'll be happy to take part in the experiment, basically. So lab in the field experiment is very similar to the lab experiment. But yes, can you mute your mic, please? I think mic is not muted. Okay, thank you. So lab in the field experiments are also conducted in a lab, but it's conducted with specific subjects. For example, in case you're talking about fertilizer preferences for farmers, you do it with farmers, but in a lab. It doesn't have to be in the field. Another way is for example, if you're testing risk preferences of new mothers, you get new mothers and then you test their risk preferences. And you're using the correct type of population sample because you are talking about new mothers and you're not using student subjects now, but you're still doing it in a lab. And it still has high internal validity and it has decent external validity because you use proper subjects. It's cheaper than field experiments, but definitely more expensive than lab experiments because you need to pay these people to come to the lab to do the experiment. And field experiments are ones that are conducted in the field. And we'll see a lot of these examples day after tomorrow in the policy session. And here you use specific subjects and it's actually done like a real life thing. And because it's real life, we have low internal validity because you cannot control a lot of things, but it is very high external validity because it's real people, real scenario, and it's usually very expensive because, like let's assume you're conducting some study with employees of some software company, you need to pay them a lot of money or a lot of resources to do it, which is why it's expensive. I just want to finish today's session with telling you how you set up a lab in your university or institution in case you're interested in. So this is how a lab usually looks like. You have these dividers, which stops people from looking at each other. And there are these computers, and usually these computers are connected like this. So these are all clients. Everything on the side are computers. And this is server, which is the common thing. This is usually useful because the experimenter sits here in the server and they can control whatever's happening in all the clients. So this is sort of the setup which most computer labs have already. And you can sort of convert it into a behavioral lab easily. It doesn't have to be this sophisticated. You can even put cardboards around or whatever. And as a part of Indian Behavioral Economics Network, like one of our next move is to create these labs in different institutions and then create a common resource. So anyone, in case I want to conduct an experiment in India, I can always go through Indian Behavioral Economics Network and find different institutions and pay them some money to conduct an experiment. So in case someone is interested, feel free to write to us later. Great. So how do you get subjects for experiments? There are various ways to do it. So you can just ask your students to sign up. You can put advertisements in the university. You can just go directly and ask them to enroll, or you can force everyone to enroll. All the students in psychology departments in most of the universities here are definitely in the subject pool. So they're forcefully enrolled. And in online experiments, you can send emails. You can post it on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, whatever. And in field, there are these recruitment agents, so who also get people for short-term employment, and you can use them as well. And there are other ways of recruiting, like online experiments like MTurk. I'll just quickly show it. So this is how MTurk looks. So it's called Amazon MTurk. Here, this is how it looks like if you're a participant. So let's say there's some study here, and this many people have taken part in it, and this is how much money I get when I take part in it. So you can post your experiment like this, and people would take part in it and make money, basically. This is one way to do it as well. This is something called Classics. I will use this tomorrow to show you some examples of how experiments are done. So tomorrow would be hands-on, and you sort of see how it works. And to quickly give you a summary of what all resources are available, there are multiple websites which now handle experiments. But basically, if there is no interaction, you can use sites like Qualtrics, Google Forms when there's interaction. You can use Classics, which we will use tomorrow because it's online, and there's something called Economic Games, which uses O3. O3 is also a specific experimental software, which is pretty good, which I've started using recently. And I use Z3 generally because it has a lot more flexibility, but it's offline. These are books which I use generally to read. I'll give you more shorter readings in the lecture tomorrow and day after tomorrow. But that's all for now. So this is how you can write to me, and this is Indian Behavioral Economics Network, and we have a Facebook page and a Twitter page, a LinkedIn page where we basically share resources with each other. And this, I think that's a very nice way to network and share information with each other. And yeah, I will wrap up there, and maybe I can take some questions for another 13 minutes before we finish this. So about the behavioral economics research, I'll give a lot more examples tomorrow and day after tomorrow, because today's session was theoretical. These are all the basics that you need to know to conduct an experiment. And yeah. So about RCTs conducted by Abhijit Banerjee and Duflo, yes, they conduct a lot of experiments, and that's sort of why they got the Nobel Prize as well. And we already saw how to control attrition bias, so I'm going to skip that question. Yeah, that's sort of all the questions that we have right now. And if you have any questions, then feel free to ask here. And since we have more time, maybe I'll just leave the screen here and feel free to check out the website. So if you just leave this part out, this is the website. And we do post events there, and we have regular networking events. And also, if someone is interested in starting networking events in different cities, then please do get in touch with us. We'll be happy to promote any sort of interaction in behavioral economics. I'll just stay here for a little longer in case you have some questions. Right, so how much importance is to be given to internal and external validity, and how do we balance it? So it depends on what exactly you want. So if you internal validity is extremely important. So it's as important as people talking about, significant value, the stars that we see in data. It's extremely important to have internal validity because it just basically talks about how good your data is. And usually we don't try to compromise on internal validity, but external validity can be compromised in certain ways. So in case your study is not super externally valid, it's completely fine, especially when it's a lab experiment and you're trying to study mechanisms and not the outcomes. So let's say you know that people react to color red. So we already saw that when people see the color red, they get hungry. And let's say you're interested in knowing why they get hungry. You don't have to have a very externally valid result there. You can try to study small mechanisms, like why did we have this? It's definitely from somewhere in the past, right? Like how did we get this this relationship of hunger and color red? So these are all like small mechanisms that we try to study. And these can be, it's okay if they're not externally valid because these are extremely important research results. And also if you look at just journals, there are some journals which give a lot of importance to external validity and there are some which don't. And you can already see that because they publish a lot of field experiments which are generally more externally valid and so on. Someone just asked, can I use experimental economic approach in the case of migration research? Yes, you can. And in fact, there's a current study that I'm working on here in Switzerland. So I'll just quickly explain it until we get some other questions. So in Switzerland, there's a lot of immigrants, and we all know that it's possible that sometimes people have these inherent biases against immigrants. We also have that in India, of course. And but the problem is that most of the data we have is when people ask them, do you think you are biased against immigrants? And imagine someone asks you that question. Of course, you're going to say, no, I'm not. Right? But we all know that we have these inherent biases, which we don't know about a lot of people. So how do we deal with it? So how do we collect that data? So what we do is we give people 2 different treatments. And in one treatment, we give people a newspaper article which says that there is a Swiss man who committed this crime. And we ask them, how much punishment do you think we should give them? And questions like that. And in the other treatment, we tell them that there's an immigrant who committed this crime. And basically, we ask them what punishment you think we should give them. And then we basically compare these 2. And we conducted a small pilot research. And we already found that people give harsher punishment. And they think it's really, really bad when an immigrant does it. And they don't think it's so bad when a Swiss person does it. And I'm pretty sure we'll see the same results. So these are these, we call these in-group, out-group biases. We'll talk a little bit about it tomorrow and social preferences. So it's basically that we always are nicer to people from our group, right? So yeah, so this is something about immigration. And there's a lot of research going on using experimental methods in migration research. Someone asked if it's possible to conduct a field experiment for impact of the program which pays people money every day for working for a short period of time on employment and wage. Yes, it's possible, but it's just that, again, there's an ethical issue. So you need to make sure that you somehow convince the participants and everybody that it's fine, and that there is no ethical problem. That's just a very critical area, because it's about employment, and you can't really randomly tell some people that they are not getting the job and tell some people that they're getting the job. So again, there's just an ethical problem which you'll have to deal with when you do that. Again, somebody asked if there are some models to study behavioral biases of investors. Can you recommend some references in this area? So again, I'll just suggest you to read some topics of behavioral finance. There's a lot of books on it. There's a lot of online resources on it. And I already shared my talk on behavioral finance, so maybe you can also look at it. It'll give you some idea on how it works. And someone asked, with intention to treat, the treatment effect will be under or overestimated. If spillover number is very small, how will it affect the beta coefficients and the treatment effect value? We sort of covered this in the talk already. With intention to treat, the treatment effect is usually underestimated. And with spillover, of course, the treatment effect is affected. The treatment effect is usually the coefficient we are interested in here. And yeah, the treatment effect is definitely affected. And again, it becomes smaller because of the spillover. How can we find out an experiment recurring objective or subjective questionnaire? I'm assuming you're asking how a questionnaire-based experiment would work. A lot of experiments are based on questionnaires, which are sent online with slightly different treatments, and then you basically compare those two. We will see a lot of examples tomorrow and day after tomorrow. So if you want a lot more on the application side, just stay tuned until tomorrow, and then you'll definitely see a lot of examples. How to check covariate balance? I already spoke a little bit about it, but basically you just look at all the information that's available on a person. So gender, age, education, where they live, the city where they're from, how much education they have, what job they do, what subject they studied, and everything. And basically just put the treatment group on one side, the control group on one side, put their means and the variance or the standard deviation, and basically check that it's not too different, basically. I can show you an example of that tomorrow because there's a lot of questions there. Academically, have behavioral economics been given enough importance as it requires? I think behavioral economics has gotten importance, at least in India, in the recent times. And like a lot of people study MBA, for example, and I personally believe that if I have a company and I need to hire someone to take care of my marketing, I would hire a behavioral economist and not an MBA graduate, because this is specifically what a behavioral economist studies, right? But I have to admit that it's not given as much importance as it should have been given. Hopefully things are changing soon, and hopefully these sort of faculty development programs would push people to start more courses in the universities, which would again push people to hire more such employees. And I'm sure there's a lot of demand now for the subject. And also, if you need help on setting up a syllabus for your course in your university, then you can contact us from Indian Behavioral Economics Network. We usually help people for free in such things. How did I choose my field in this profession? So I was always interested in psychology and in economics. And I used to basically try to combine both these fields by myself and try to come up with some insights, because I did not know that something called behavioral economics existed. And later, as I started reading a lot of books and exploring, I realized that there's already a huge field out here about behavioral economics. And yeah, I just got interested in it, and that's how I chose this field. And I find this a bit more realistic. It's very interesting because it's about real people. And yeah, we'll just have like 2 more minutes and then we'll wrap up. Maybe in the meanwhile, I can show you how classics works. Great. So this is how Classics websites look. Can you look at it? I hope you can look at it. So this is how Classics website looks like. So here they sometimes already have some experiments there. So for example, there are these experiments here already. And let's look at standard games. And let's take Dictator game. You can already view it. And this is how it looks. Oh, it's in German. Wait. Okay. So this is how it looks. So here there are these different boxes. For example, this is an input box where we get how much money they send and so on. So these are the variables that it collects, and this is how it looks. And here you can already decide how you do your assignment, how you match the people, how many rows you want. You can have 2, 3, 4, whatever you want. And then here you can already see your results as well when you start conducting your experiment. And I'll show tomorrow how you can see live result. As people start finishing the experiment, you can already see the data here. So tomorrow would be a hands-on course, and you'll sort of see how it looks. So what books do you suggest to read on psychology? So again, I think the professor who spoke the other day covered it. So I would also suggest you not to start with Daniel Kahneman. Great book, but not great for starting with the subjects. I think it's great to start with Dan Ariely. His books are fun to read, and yeah, you can basically use it as a bedtime read. It's really interesting. And yeah, I think after that you can start moving on to Thaler and Daniel Kahneman and so on. And there's a lot of resources that we have already collected in our website and IBEN website, and you can already look at it. And I'll go add a little more this week. If we want to pursue this as a profession, if you wish to pursue, yeah, there's a lot of resources. Again, I think there's a person called, forgot her name, but there's a blog called Money on the Mind, and it's called Money on the Mind. And I think she talks a lot about career guidance and things like that. And yeah, maybe you can look there. And there are also a lot of consulting companies in India and abroad that you can apply to in case you want to proceed here as this profession. Great. So the time is up now. So maybe we can wrap. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you organizers for conducting this great session. I'll see you tomorrow then.
Thank you very much, madam. You give us an excellent experience with real life examples that makes our learning more enjoyable and fruitful. I trust all the participants benefited from this session. We wait for your further sessions in the coming days. Dear participants, thank you very much for being with us for the last 3 days. We look forward to meeting you tomorrow also in the same platform. Tomorrow talk will be on social preferences by Junofy and Rozarina of University of Zurich. Same time, 11:30 a.m. Indian Standard Time and 8 a.m. Swiss time. Thank you. Thank you, one and all.